Hey, this is Chris.
Hey, it's
You
Kevan.
should do. Hey, we were already talking. We were already
We've
chit-chatting
been
about
talking
some
for
stuff.
25 minutes and
Yeah.
or 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever.
So we thought maybe we just hit record because we're talking about something totally different than what we were thinking about talking about. So we thought maybe just go with it. Just today in a thread, we were reminded of Elder Bednar talking about if we have choice or free choice or not. Should I just pull the actual video? Okay.
Sure.
Ready, spaghetti.
The principle of moral agency is the least understood of all gospel principles. It is taught incorrectly often, and it leads people to behave in ways that are not appropriate. As I listen to members of the church all over the world, this is how they define agency. It's the ability to choose, and I can do what I want. That's false. Why do we have agency? Go find in the Pearl of Great Price, in the book of Moses, God's explanation for why we have agency. It is to choose him, not to choose what we want, but to choose God and to love and serve each other. Now, buckle up. Are you buckled up? Okay, here we go. When you and I enter the baptismal covenants, there are three conditions of the covenant: a willingness to take upon ourselves the name of Christ, a commitment to always remember him, and a commitment to keep the commandments. We learn about those elements of the covenant, and we exercise our agency to accept those conditions of the covenant. We then are promised that if we honor the covenant, we may always have God's Spirit to be with us. Okay. As we pledge our...
Oh, there's a translator going on behind there that's edited out, isn't
Yeah.
there? That's what it is. Okay.
willingness to take upon ourselves the name of Christ. That begins in the waters of baptism. It begins. We do not wholly and totally take upon ourselves the name of Christ in the waters of baptism. We begin. As we begin to have the name of Christ come upon us through ordinances and covenants, we have a new family name, Christian. And with that name, we are to represent him at all times and in all places and in all things. Now, this is why you need to be buckled up. When we enter into that covenant and begin to have the name of Christ come upon us, our agency is enlarged. It's no longer individual agency. It is enlarged to become representative agency and representing Christ and his name at all times, in all places, and in all things becomes more important than what we want. The reason we need to always remember him is so we can effectively represent him. We have already pledged that we will keep the commandments. Have you heard someone say, a member of the church who has entered into the baptismal covenant, I have my agency, I can do what I want? You ever heard that? Yeah, you know what the answer is? No, you can't. You don't understand agency. You don't have agency to do whatever you want. We have the hymn Choose the Right, don't we? In Espanol? The hymn is called Choose the Right, not choose what you want. So from tonight on, don't ever use a misunderstood concept of agency to justify sin. You can't just choose what you want. And when you begin to understand that principio, then you're on the road to becoming spiritually self-reliant, dependent upon God, and devoted to representing him all the time, everywhere. Now, I want to say this in terms that I hope won't be scary, but they're true. If, after having entered into the covenant, we don't abide by the conditions of the covenant. So, for example, if you and I don't pay our tithing, do we have the option not to pay our tithing? Nope.
No.
It's breaking a covenant. It is not the exercise of agency anymore. Because what happened to our individual agency? It was enlarged. Now it's more important to represent him. Is this making sense?
No, it's not making sense. I think he's just got a bad definition of what the word agency is.
Well, no, I do think that because this actually here's okay. My I'm going to kind of give him some of the benefit of the doubt here. Having been a real estate agent and learning about the legal definition of agency, okay, it's not he's not defining it as agency as in the freedom of choice necessarily. Okay, but what he's saying is okay. So, for example, as a real estate agent, and I'm not a licensed agent anymore. When you get your real estate license, you become an agent you're an agent in two ways. You represent your clients, Okay, so if you got a buyer for a house or a seller of a house, you represent them, but you also have a fiduciary agency relationship with your broker. Your broker is the one who has really the major legal responsibility for the real estate transaction. And so when I look at it in this kind of a framing that Bednar's coming across,
You think he's talking about it in a legalistic lawyerly action?
What is the context here? Is he talking to youth?
No, he's in Argentina, just like talking like a ward or a steak or something
Okay,
like that.
because I think that he might be using terms that are a little bit above like what the average person sees.
But I think that's usually the problem is you got to define your terms.
Right, and I agree with that. I think that in the context of making a covenant, when you make a covenant, it should curtail your agency, and that's what I'm saying. Your personal, let's say you
have agency to break a covenant.
Yeah, you do,
That's why the word agency doesn't make sense there.
Right, and I understand that, and I think that can you go break the you get baptized, you make a covenant, you go through the temple, you make covenants. Can you break those covenants? Yes, you can break those covenants, but you're not free. I think that in looking at the way he's defining it, I would say that you make a covenant and you're held to a higher law after making that covenant than you would if you weren't. Do you get what I'm saying? And I
totally understand that, but I think it just could have been said that way.
It could have. It could have. I think that this way is kind of a little bit too simplistic and black and white of a way, and maybe a little bit too hard
just needed to step back and to define the terms a little bit. Yeah. Like, I just found this, like, what does God's agency mean? And this thing says, agency is the ability and privilege God gives us to choose and act for ourselves. And maybe what he's saying is you now are no longer just acting for yourself. You are acting for you and Christ.
Right. I personally prefer the way that Neal A. Maxwell put it, where he talked about saying that, or was it Neal A. Maxwell?
Oh, I pulled a bunch of clips. And the reason I even have these clips, I didn't pull them now. I just pulled them because I got into an argument with let's just finish this out in case there's anything else to hear.
Yeah.
If some night you don't want to go to sleep, read the scriptures and learn about what happens to covenant breakers. I guarantee you will not go to sleep. Now, I don't want to scare you, but I want you to understand this is serious. Agency.
But covenant breaking and the consequences is an act of agency. That's just it's just like a definition confusion.
Is the center point of our mortal experience. With that agency, we are agents to act. That's self-reliance. We are not objects to be acted upon. That is the absence of self-reliance. Now, go find more in the scripture. That's just the beginning.
I just think it's like confused. I think it just seems like a confused description.
When we talk about free agency, does it simply just mean what's the definition of agency? Do you know what I mean? It just made me think of that what I had learned about being a real estate agent, and in that context of agency, you're making decisions on behalf of another party. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's like, well, now you are acting not just for yourself, you're acting for yourself and another person. So you have to take both persons. And so if you're taking on the name of Christ now, technically you have this added belief that your agency is not just your agency, it's yours and Christ's agencies together. And so you should take that into every action that you're taking. So just realize it's maybe like a way to reimagine that you have a higher responsibility, you're not just acting on your own in the world, which I think is maybe like a fine construal. It's just, I think it could have been worded to make that understood or something.
Right. Right. I don't disagree with that,
because I think these other quotes that I remember I pulled them up because I got into an argument with a believing guy who was talking about, boy, oh boy, look how great China did with their COVID numbers. You and I both know this guy. I think I showed it to you when this thing happened. And I said, so what's your concept? You think we should have lockdowns as strong as China has it? Let's put aside that it's dubious that their numbers are real, because they're an authoritarian state. But putting that aside, let's pretend it's real. Are you saying that we should remove all our agency to keep the people safe? And I think that's part of what we are looking at so much lately, especially like when going to the thing about the lake that we just talked about. All the stuff we're talking about is there's people kind of pushing on us and coming up with safety reasons for why we need to now take over these things, which I guess
Right.
remind me to pull up that quote by C.S. Lewis. And another thing that happened recently where the church is now being supposedly put through or required to do background checks for children in California.
Yeah.
So let's go through some of these. Howard W. Hunter. It's important to remember that Jesus was capable of sinning, that he could have succumbed, that the plan of life and salvation could have been foiled, but that he remained true. Had there been no possibility of his yielding to the enticement of Satan, there would have been no real test, no genuine victory in the result. If he had been stripped of the faculty to sin, he would have been stripped of his very agency. So, I mean, he obviously can't be talking about that. Can't be like what Bednar means.
No.
It just sounded like that's what he means. That's why that clip is kind of famous through.
I agree with that, because I mean, well, to say technically that you don't have agency goes against the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I don't think that he was meaning it in that example. I kind of took it more of as a pragmatic, like sort of like, I mean, what's the function of religion? Function of religion is to set ideals in your life, really, is to live to an ideal. If you want to look at it in a Petersonian way, Christ was the ideal. You know what I mean? And to live your life as Christ is to try to live to the ideal. You're not going to do it. That's why there's atonement, and that's why there's the concept of taking the sacrament, to be able to recommit yourself to that, because you're gonna screw up every week. That's the way I look at it. I have agency. I screw up every week, man. You know?
I think the agency, it's a big fat deal. Obviously, it's one of the centers of all Mormondom. And I think it's because of what some of these guys say right here is one of the things that makes Mormonism have one of the best theologies there is about this. I like the concept of Jesus was about choice and Satan was about no choice. That's one they've held to, right? They haven't changed that. I don't know if that appears in Doctrine and Covenants. Don't mean to put you out in like a biblical reference spot or a Doctrine and Covenant spot, but I do think that's unique to Mormonism. That you always hear in ex-Mormonism that like there's nothing unique about Mormonism that isn't bad, and there's nothing about Mormonism that's good that you can't find elsewhere. Yeah. But I think that agency doctrine, I think it is pretty unique to Mormonism. I think it is.
I think it is. And one of the things that deepened it for me was coming to understand also the idea of logos.
Yeah.
And so when you understand, you take also, for example, what is it in Isaiah or something like that, where he says, "Come, let us reason one with another. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow." I mean, I've always had this idea, and I've said this before, but you know, I see God as a rational entity as well as a spiritual one. To me, it's yin and yang. It's science can explain things that faith necessarily can't, and faith does the same thing, just in a different way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Let's look at just a couple more of these. I think this is shaping up, but it's totally different than the subject I thought we were going to go with. But I guess it all comes down together, because really what we're talking about.
We'll talk about why we're talking about this, because you know why it was brought up, and in the context of
the core of everything is agency. Really, I mean, the core of everything. The reason we're pushing back onto Lynn and Larson so much is we're taking a liberal or libertarian angle against them because they preach such progressive, authoritarian, leftist talking points. And one of the reasons, like Kevin and I, or Flip and I, or Jared and I can kind of see eye to eye on that sort of stuff, is we're not talking, do you believe in God or don't believe in God? We're talking this level of, do you believe in free agency or not in free agency? And that kind of seems to be one of the dividing lines, or use that word free agency. Do you believe in leaving people alone? I don't know how else to just say it simply right there.
Well, so here's my take on the whole plan of salvation, if you will, right? Is that, okay, first, and I talk to my kids about this too. I'm like, okay, first thing is that he creates you, right? He creates you spiritually. The first gift after your creation he gives you is your agency, your ability to choose. And you can't, I mean, how can you even progress in life if you can't make choices, and you can't course correct, and you can't learn from choices? You know what I mean?
You got it. Sometimes you got to learn for bad choices, even long periods of bad choice.
Okay, so let me also throw this out there. I come from a very imperfect family. Okay, I think I might have highlighted this before. I will say that I grew up Jack Mormon, right? I think I might have said that before too. So here's the thing. I had a hard time growing up in, I mean, I loved a lot of the people that I grew up around in the church, you know, but there always were some, I think this is where a lot of people get heartburn, is that they'll have had experiences with somebody who's just really hard nosed about, you know, and very, well, this is maybe not necessarily to the level of Pharisee, but maybe so. Maybe we're encroaching into the territory of authoritarianism within the church and within faith. I don't know. It can be a combination of a lot of things, but maybe some people grow up in maybe a really strong family that's really, really militarily strict, you know, and that kind of stuff. But let me tell you this, you go in elite circles anywhere and you're going to find the same thing in just maybe a different angle.
So one of the huge things that I've been looking at a lot lately is, how do you come to truth? How do we bat around each other with these ideas if we're all imperfect humans trying to figure it out and whatnot? And then, of course, you have the religious ideas that get to it, and then the non-religious ideas. I think one way or the other, one of the things that kind of pushes back to the logos, to use that term, but it doesn't necessarily just have to be that term, is that there's got to be discussion. There's got to be back and forth.
Right.
And you might call that the Hegelian dialectic, although I think the Hegelian dialectic kind of perverts it a little bit.
I think it's a little bit more, what is it?
Dialogos.
Who
Dialogos. You got two logoses talking to.
Is it the Socratic dialectic?
It's a Platonic dialectic that is about how do you act in the world. But the logos and that stuff goes back to Socrates too. And one of the reasons I point to that is the concept of the logos, and I like using the logos too, precedes Christianity, but then it got enveloped into Christianity. So we had the Midnight Mormons, I guess we'll pull it up, but this week they had this podcast called Atheism is Stupid. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they were talking about is, because you don't have that center axiomatic point of a God or a logos, but somebody like John Vervaeke could argue like, no, I'm going with that logos thing too, and I consider myself an atheist. But what he considers the logos isn't far off from a God. Does that make sense? It's kind of arguing the same thing at the same time.
Right. And I was going to say also that when it comes to the grand scheme of things, you're going to serve something anyway.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's just how life is. So you're going to serve, you know, it's Nietzsche, you know, people don't have ideas have people. I agree with you though. I agree. I do believe in agency. I do believe in that we have free will and that kind of thing.
Well, one of the things about it is it's kind of like negative rights and positive rights. And one of the things that's so hard for people to understand, the difference between like a libertarian versus a progressive idea, is that a libertarian or a liberal point of view looks at the negative rights, which are things that are like you're just right to make a choice, or right to survive, or right to live and breathe, right to, like, owning a gun is a negative choice. That's not the government buys and gives you a gun. It means I can have a thing. I can have a thing and you can't take the thing from me.
Right.
And I get to own it. And it almost shouldn't even be, it's kind of more like the John Lockean concept of one of the negative rights is property. It almost shouldn't even say guns. It should just say you can own a thing, and a gun's a thing, you know, and that's about all there is to it. And
yeah, I mean, I look at it as tools. I own a lot of tools that could jack you up, that could kill you. You know what I mean? I could run at you with a saw, you know what I mean, or whatever. And
but the concept of it too is that I can't say, no, you don't own a gun, and then suddenly you don't own a gun. That's one of the things about those negative rights. But no, you could easily own a gun. Whereas a positive right, whereas I owe you a gun, or I owe you a healthcare, I could take that away from you. You know,
right?
I can't take away your right to own a thing that I can't be around you 24/7 to make sure. I guess unless you're imprisoned. So most of the Constitution is concerning itself with those negative rights. And nowadays with the progressive movement, Bernie Sanders wants to call everything a right, and Elizabeth Warren, that's just one of their moves, to say healthcare is a right, and it's stuff that somebody else's labor has to give you that thing. It's not just a negative right that you're allowed to have that thing, should you be able to get it.
Yeah, I guess we're probably moving in the direction of kind of how contextually we're talking about maybe above and beyond like the church and stuff like that.
Well, if we talk about fractal levels between me and you might say that it isn't above and beyond it. It is all the same thing. Yeah, especially if your worldview is that the church is that all-encompassing thing, or at least the metaphysical part of it, not the organization part of it.
Right.
But in some sort of senses, we can get to why Kevan and I our religion's pretty much the same thing, if that makes sense. And pull off of these guys too. Like, I think these are some of the better phrases ever uttered about agency. It's one of the things I love about Mormons and Mormonism, you know.
Yeah.
What else are we told we are? We are an independent free agent, and some people think to do as we please, but that isn't quite correct. We do have our free agency, and now let me read you something about that. Will you mark down 2 Nephi, 2nd chapter, verses 15 and 16? I tell you, I think this was a great risk that our Father was taking to send us down here with the privilege of our agency to make a choice.
I think that's huge. I mean, it's the whole idea too, like what Peterson will talk about it, about the good mother fails.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You have to, I mean, and I thought about this on my mission too, is like, I remember when I was really kind of getting deep in that, like, you know, it's the whole concept of you know, mother bird's going to push her baby out of the nest. Yeah. It has to, or it can't progress. Yeah. And you can't progress. See, that's, you know, eternal death, I guess. You know what I mean? But you might die trying.
If you think about it, if God's there, and this is one of the things atheists will always be, if God real, why he let bad things happen? But there's also the other level of God believes in agency so much that if he put you down in a little basket of the world, what the earth is, somebody could use their agency to do something terrible to you, and he's not going to stop it because the agency has to play out.
And through that.
Yeah. President Benson encouraged Latter-day Saints and others to use their agency to act on their own without waiting to be commanded in all things. Agency has been given to all of us to make important decisions that will have bearing on our salvation. The plan and body, the privilege to be given to every soul to choose for himself liberty and eternal life through obedience to the laws of God, or captivity and death as to spiritual things because of disobedience. Next to life itself, free agency is God's greatest gift to mankind, providing thereby the greatest opportunity for the children of God to advance in this second estate mortality. Agency to willingly act as God would hear, with opportunities and enticements to do otherwise. Flip and I went on and talked with Marty from Mormon Discussions, and she was kind of pushing on us saying, why do we think it's different if we're bullying up on John DeLynn versus other people, or if it's any sort of different thing, and kind of what our answer was. It's a little bit like the libertarian non-aggression principle. You know what I mean? It's like, leave people alone. And if you leave people alone, you're fine. If you don't leave people alone, if you kind of start embarking on pushing on other people, then you're going to get the screws held to you too. That makes stuff kind of open game. And they might say, well, we're just doing that to the church because the church is pushing on other people, and say, well, fine, but we're going to test that, or put the claims that you make to test. We're going to test it out, which is, I have another quote by Karl Popper that says that, well, that's basically the essence of all of us are doing, is pushing back and forth, trying to get towards some sort of better truth.
Right.
C.S. Lewis, of all tyrannies, the tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber barons cruelly may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience.
This is like the heart of the zeitgeist.
Yeah. That's the entire thing. That's all the stuff we're pointing to with the ESG stuff, or Eat the Bugs by those guys. The whole,
all the wokesters,
movement,
all the
wokesters, all the coof pushing. What we have is moral busybodies who think they've got the Gnostic answer to how to save the universe and save the world.
So then it comes down to which prophets do you want to follow?
Yeah. So they just barely blew up those Georgia, what's those called?
Georgia Guidestones.
Those were so dumb. I kind of couldn't believe those even existed.
I know.
Who even put them up in the first place?
They don't know. That's the thing.
It's just like randomly placed in the middle of Georgia for some reason.
George Soros. Uh-oh. I just got a flag.
Man. All right. Are you ready? I don't know, man. If you didn't listen to this, if you didn't pre-listen to it,
he just looks like a Muppet, man. He really does. He looks like Guy Smiley. He really does, man.
What's that? What's Guy Smiley?
Yeah, I mean, I just expect him to be ushering in some game show, on Sesame Street here.
And now it's time to play everybody's favorite game, Name That Sound. And here's everybody's favorite game show host, Guy Smiley.
Thank
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is Guy Smiley, America's favorite game show host, and we're here to play Name That Sound.
So let's see if you can get through this without your head popping off. Let's see.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. John DeLynn, host of Mormon Stories
Dr. John DeLynn. He's a doctor.
podcast. Yesterday, I received the following video recording of an LDS or Mormon Church stake conference in Davis County, Utah, wherein the first counselor of the stake presidency was addressing the topic of whether or not young Mormon men should serve 2-year missions for the church. Unfortunately, this is one of the most disturbing things I've heard in quite a while, and so I wanted to share it with you in hopes that we can help
Since
the
the
church
80s.
change it.
Since the 80s?
Its rhetoric around missions and choice and free agency. Roll the tape.
A little tangent here real quick. We were recently as a family having a discussion about missionary work. One of my daughters was at school. She was talking with her friends about President Nelson's recent call for young men to serve missions. And the friends there at the lunch table were debating, do young men have to go, or is it a choice? Now, young men, I hope you'll think about this carefully, because there's an important doctrine here. Do you have a choice whether to serve a mission? I'm going to tell you why you don't. Now, that might rub you the wrong way, because we're so big into liberty and agency, and we do believe we're a free, democratic kind of people, right? But here's why you don't have the choice anymore. It's because when you were baptized, you signed on to the Lord's plan.
It sounds like he's repeating Bednar pretty specifically there.
Which is giving up free agency and accepting moral agency. The difference being that we give up thinking that we know for ourselves what is best in our lives, and we trust the Lord to give us the direction that is best for us in our lives. And so, young men, if that sounds like foreign doctrine to you, I hope you'll reconsider the importance of that baptismal and sacramental covenant, where every week we come to church and we say, I'm giving up what I think is best, and I trust the Lord to guide and direct me in my life. And His will becomes paramount. And no longer is what we want the most important thing in our lives. We recognize that what the Lord can give us is much greater than anything we could choose for ourselves.
In conclusion, I would like to make
Gosh, that was harmful.
a few quick points for any young Mormon thinking about serving a Mormon mission. Number one, you always have a choice, especially when you're an adult. Number two, run away from any human that tells you you don't have a choice. Number three, beware of any human that tells you that they know what God wants for you in your life. That's your job to figure out, not theirs. Number four, when you were baptized, you were far too young to make that decision. Your brain wasn't even fully developed yet. It probably still isn't. And you were definitely...
Yeah. Brain developed and kids making choices. Tough territory there, Ray Dillon. Tough
So you
territory.
can't make any choices till you're 25.
Well, unless that choice is to change your genitals.
Oh, yes.
That's a
Oh, so that's how this. Oh, yeah, that's how this all started.
good.
Or it was one of the ideas that was thrown out there right at the beginning too. Yes.
Well, so one of the things that happened is Rock Waterman put a post up on Mormon Stories on Sunday, and he's kind of been a big blogger in ex-Mormon world for a long time, and he came out and was advertising Matt Walsh's documentary on What is a Woman, and saying he was kind of fully in line with it, and was maybe in a bit of a salty way because he was throwing out a bunch of jokes sort of too, talking about social contagion and all that sort of stuff. And that got deleted off of Mormon Stories in about, 10 minutes time.
Mm-hmm.
And, but then of course this comes out almost like the same day.
So he didn't have any agency to be able to voice his
Well, that's one of the other things. It's been the ongoing back and forth between the left and the right about these corporations and Twitter. And should you have a chance to have free speech on that? And do they have the right to delete your free speech? And
yes, this is a interesting conundrum here.
not given all of the information that you needed to make a lifelong, let alone eternal decision. Number five, When you were baptized, you were probably heavily influenced by wanting to make your family or your friends happy. Number 6, in short, your baptism was likely not a choice. Instead, it was something you did to please those you loved.
Oh my goodness. Oh, this psychology of this. The psychology.
Mhm.
It's such deep psychology about what kids can and can't choose. Ugh. Say that those choices have more to do with what their parents wanted and not the kid.
I'm just glad when you leave the
Oh,
I'm just glad when you leave the church, you're free of all of that.
yeah.
Number 7, as a matter of informed consent, you should know that in 2022, up to 1/3 of all Mormon missionaries who are leaving on a mission are coming home early. This is normally due to things like significant depression, significant anxiety, and oftentimes due to a loss of faith while serving a mission. If you're going to make the decision to serve a mission, you should know what you're up for. There are reasons why people are returning home with anxiety, depression, and a loss of faith from their mission. One of the main reasons
There's a reason people are detransitioning.
is that they were not told the truth about the church when they were growing up. Number 8, your main job in life right now, in my opinion, is to work hard to figure out what is healthiest for you in your life. That's your job. Don't let anybody tell you that they know what's best for you. Go on a mission if you sincerely believe that it will be healthy for you. If you do not believe that a mission would be healthy for you, or if you want to do something else with your life, that is your choice. Full stop. Finally, a message to the Mormon Church. Please stop this very harmful and manipulative language. Thank you.
I don't disagree with in fact, I actually told my kids, and this is where I'll maybe go off the rails there, but I've told my kids I don't expect you to go on a mission. You know what I mean? If you go because you make the choice to go, because I saw plenty of missionaries out there who didn't want to be there. And honestly, they made it crappy for everyone.
They're terrible to have out there.
Yeah, they really are.
The ones who definitely didn't want to be there or who were there because their parents were going to buy them a truck.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
it was like
that was
go
a big
home,
thing.
please go home.
That was a big thing in our generation. I think that after us, maybe that kind of a whole thing, because I think that it was.
Well, I heard for a while they got a lot stricter and they did get a lot better.
We know people whose parents gave them a new Toyota truck because they went on a mission.
Yeah, well, I knew people who were out there who would just announce it and say it. They'd say, "Yeah, I'm just here because my parents said they'd do this and this and this for me if I came." And those guys were always just a nightmare. They were a nightmare for the other missionaries to deal with.
Right.
Those guys would kind of just be what we called fritos on my mission. And some of them were either party guys and just always trying to push the party and go do stuff and sneak off and run around with girls and stuff like that. Then some of the other ones were just completely shut-ins. I had a companion once who would shut himself in the bathroom. It was the hardest. I went through a divorce. When I was going through a divorce, I would think about this time on my mission and I'd say, I've been through worse than this, and it wasn't bad just because the mission. What was bad was this time frame where we were trying to go out. I was trying to just do fine, do good. And I wasn't getting upset because I wasn't doing missionary work. It's just, I was in this little house in the middle of nowhere, Mexico, 4 cement walls, not any bigger than 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet, and a plastic roof over our heads. So it was just a piece of plastic set on the 4-cylinder walls. And I was in that room for almost 3 months. So it's basically solitary confinement with a guy who refused to leave it, just refused to go outside. It was a waking, living nightmare. And all I could do was sit there and read Jesus the Christ over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And because I didn't have any other books or any other stuff like that. And man, it would have been nice if that guy just didn't go.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, on the Midnight Mormons, I saw Jacob Hansen, who was coming out salty, talking about atheism is stupid. But I don't take offense to when those guys talk like that. I also kind of know that they're trying to you're saying about Bednar, you're saying a bombastic thing, or you're saying a strong kind of like a paternalistic thing. Maybe sometimes you got to come out strong in your rhetoric.
Right.
But Jacob Hansen was just saying today, we got to knock it off of trying to turn over and bend over backwards to try to keep people in the church who don't want to be in a church. He said that on Facebook, and I've always agreed with that.
I
let them go. If they want to go, let them go.
That's the whole, I think, one of the whole underlying narratives of the prodigal son story.
Yeah.
It's like, you got a choice. You can, and you're going to have a choice no matter what character you are in that story.
Mm-hmm.
But again, yeah, I don't think that John Dehlin actually, I actually agreed with a bit of what he said, but I think that he ends up making everything overly simplistic and like we're going to throw away everything else that the church has ever said. You know what I mean? Because I think that there, as you just showed, there's a heck of a lot more quotes and doctrine behind the fact that we do have agency. And hey, Second Nephi chapter 2, the whole chapter, that's what it's talking about. So, but I agree. I do think that setting in the expectation like is not necessarily a bad thing, but you know what? You have to, like, as my kids were growing up, I did talk to my kids about it. I said, this is what you should be working toward. But if you don't want to go, I'm not going to think one way or the other. I'm not going to, and I actually have my son right now recently made the decision to go on a mission of his own self. I kind of pushed him a bit, and I just in saying that, like, hey, it really benefited me in my life, and there's not a day that goes by that I actually don't think how it affected my life. I said that to him when he graduated. What are you going to do with your life? I kind of pushed a couple of times, and then I just said, okay, I'm done. He said, no, I'm not going to go, and I'm like, cool. So then we just moved on. And then he ended up going to a year of college, and during that year, he decided he made his own choice to go, and that's the only way I really would have wanted it to be, is him making that choice himself.
Not only is that awesome, it's awesome that you kind of took that, what we view as like the father figure of the God figure angle on it, but it played out like you would have liked to play it out, which isn't even just that he went, it's that he chose to go. And he really did choose he didn't feel that pressure from you. I didn't feel pressure from my parents either. I actually felt more pressure from more of a outside society, but my parents never came at me for saying that you got to go on a mission or anything like that. I did feel somewhat pressured into it, but when I think back on it, I was like, who was pressuring me? And it was this larger societal thing, but like happens all the time. The Jordan Peterson thing, women make you feel naked. It was girls.
Yeah.
It was girls
Well,
that made me.
Here's the thing. No matter what, if you have parents that don't put a little bit of pressure on you to make some sort of decision when you graduate high school, you don't got good parents.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're not looking out for your interest and your growth.
Everything gets kind of tough because like nowadays it's taken as offensive to give any sort of guideline or put any sort of pressure of doing anything, making any sort of pressure to act in this world. That's almost kind of one of the strange substrates of the argument between Marxism versus non-Marxism. There's all this thought on the side of the Marxist world that they've been thrust into this experience and they never chose this experience, so they shouldn't be having to do any of it because it was forced upon them. Just the experience of living.
Yep.
Jared given a couple funny some of his favorite memes is to like, my parents suffered through the gulag, and some girl says, oh, the gulag, well, I have to suffer through living in the United States. It's like one person's like, oh, your parents had to go to prison and you had to get a job. Oh, boo-hoo. And that really is kind of like the essence of some of the crying about.
What's the basketball gal right now in China?
Oh, I forget her name. Yeah,
Brittany Griner, is that what it is?
Yeah, I think it is.
I saw some funny memes,
about her finding out what another country thinks about her. She'd protested the United States, and now she's finding out they don't care so much about those protests.
Down with the patriarchy. Until I go to jail in a foreign land.
Yeah. All right, let's listen to the Midnight Mormons talk a little bit about that logos. Well, they didn't pull out the logos. You pulled out the logos, but
okay, hold on,
dude.
Right. When an atheist says that a person should or should not do something, when they use moral language, they are appealing to a moral standard that they have no way of justifying. And if you don't believe that moral truth exists, then why are you making moral truth claims?
No, I agree, but you picked it. I was like, I went straight for the topic.
Oh,
jugular.
But no, but that it is atheists rob themselves of the ability to speak on moral issues, and I don't mean that they can't be, because people are like, oh, well, you're saying that atheists can't be moral. Like, shut up. You need to go and actually understand the arguments that we're making. The argument is not that you cannot be moral. The thing is you can't provide a standard for what is or is not moral. Morality loses all meaning in your world.
The Jordan Peterson Sam Harris debate completely shows that Sam Harris has no ground.
Well, and I love that you brought that up, Brad, because I want to play a little yes and game. Is we just talked about in a previous video the importance of epistemology and giving credence to spiritual knowledge through self-evidence. All right. And then the atheist would say, oh no, only empirical evidence matters. No, they appeal to self-evidence all the time.
Bingo.
In fact, when Sam Harris was asked specifically on stage, you know, well, if you're atheist, how can you believe in morality? His only answer was literally like, well, I just thought that we were like past that argument at this point.
Just like you kind of agreed with John DeLynn, I agree with them there. But one of the things about it is that I think right when I first came on with them, right off the bat, I told them one of the ways you can understand me a little bit is I'm somebody who claims atheism, but I think Jordan Peterson won that debate. And these guys are kind of making some of the same arguments, although it's like a little bit of a different thing because they're talking about moral truth and that debate was just general truth a little bit. But the one thing I can push back on them on is I guess we already did it, is that an atheist like John Vervaeke, we can point at the Logos, which the Logos is kind of about the same thing as a God. The only difference is these guys all believe in a Mormon God. So they have a very specific God. And that's where stuff gets into, obviously there's other theological debates behind all those things of like which God is the right God. But I answered back to them. I told them like, hey, I have gone down these rabbit holes that you're saying that we haven't gone down. I've gone way down them, and I'm constantly going down them. But I'm kind of the exception that proves the point. You know, I don't want to like crap on a generalized point because I do think that they are generally correct about how general internet atheists, whatever the modern day growing atheist movement acts and doesn't think that hard about those types of things. So it's not to be like, hey, no, there's me. There's just like we know when we're talking in generalities about the way a general crowd or a general movement moves. I think it's kind of ridiculous to say, no, there's one, but we can get to the point. And I've been in this, it's just too big of a subject, but I mean, that's where we get into the postmodernism and the deconstruction of, they'll say like Leotard will say like grand narratives and all that stuff, but at some other level, it's kind of more the underlying substrate, the underlying axioms. And those, the Logos might be the axiom of all axioms. And it's kind of hard for...
Well, and Peterson really kind of, I think he's been talking about that a lot lately too. And I think that is one of the things that one point he's driven home big time. I mean, going on Rogan and talking about, you know, the Bible is truer than anything else because everything hangs on it.
Yeah. And it's because it's kind of like a starting point. It's like
everything in the West, let's say.
Everything we talk about, everything we act about. Now, I was actually just listening to this other thing from Auron MacIntyre, which there was a whole other rabbit hole with that we could have gone down this week, but he was talking about Oswald Spengler. And Oswald Spengler pointed this thing out that I've seen Eric Weinstein and Brett Weinstein point out just on their own without even knowing Spengler, is that the atheism of a culture is a very particularized atheism to that religion. Does that make sense?
As men become more civilized, they lose the spirituality that built and shaped their civilization. The more civilized man begins to try to bear the inevitable suffering of life with intellect rather than the soul, in an attempt to gain further control over the civilization that they've created. Spengler says that in turn, each civilization has its own unique form of atheism, which is tailored to oppose the spirituality of that age. He identifies Buddhism as the atheism of the East, Stoicism as the atheism for classical Roman pagan religion, and socialism as the West's own personal brand of atheism tailored for Christianity. Spengler points out these philosophies are usually very materialistic compared to their counterparts, and that they tend to focus on control and management of the here and the now. Spengler points out that these in-stage philosophies often trap their adherents in a tyranny of reason, because they are constructed of and dependent on elaborate, unchanging, and stifling structures. They have been adapted more for the maintenance of society rather than the creation of it, and they drain the religious and spiritual impulses that forged the culture in the first place.
I mean, I'll claim Christian atheism. That's what I did in my comment to the Mormons, or I'll claim Mormon atheism if I'm going to say I'm an atheist, because we're bouncing off those ideas. But Spengler went into great detail talking about how Buddhism was an atheism versus up against the some sort of Chinese believing system. And I remember in the argument, one of the arguments with Peterson and Harris, Eric Weinstein pointed out, I noticed that your atheism seems very Jewish, Sam. You know, and he was pointing out that you still pull all of your accents from that. And I kind of like the imagery that Carden gave. Like, you guys don't realize that you got all your momentum from the engine of a religion, and now you're on a bike or something. And now you're just coasting on it, hoping that you can keep coasting on it, but you won't be able to grow from it. And that's actually one of the things that all the way back to John Lynn, yeah, you're coasting on it, and it's going to fall apart. You're not going to keep going up. And Spengler actually wrote a ton about that, saying that you kind of need a religious imagination to build, and the atheist imagination is always a deconstruct, and the deconstruction is going to coast off of the goodwill or the good culture that was built off of that. But I always kind of point to John Vervaeke here, and this is a great conversation between the Calvinist. What is Pageau? He's a Eastern Orthodox Christian now. Mm-hmm. This guy's name's Jordan as well, but I forget I forget exactly what he is. And Vervaeke, he's a Buddhist, like an atheist Buddhist, but his language, and it's a difficult language. It's one of the things Paul talks about here in this, is that when these guys go and talking, their talking is wrapped up in Christian definitions. This wraps back into Bednar, and there's so much Christian in talking that people already needed to know between the stuff they're saying. And I've talked to some other people, like Vanderklay and his people are talking about some of the same things that Derrida and Foucault were talking about and always have been. It's just they use different language for it. They use theological language for it. Pageau, for sure, especially. And Pageau was able to kind of recognize how they overlapped, and Vanderklay's gone learning that. But they've always been talking about perception and the trouble of perception and action and acting in the world, and the noumenon and nominalism and all these types of things. Only they had their own Christian language for it. And there's a bit of that going on here with what the atheists or even ex-Mormons are kind of doing when they're eavesdropping in on some of that Mormon conversation going on right there. Because those guys are kind of making points using something that has like a pre-altered definition that's in talk. It's kind of Christian in talk, or even Mormon in talk. I don't know where exactly they're pulling that up. That's kind of more just philosophy, just general philosophy. Because if any sort of philosopher that you go and start reading, you first have to learn all their different little languages and how particular they were about that language. Right. Because just like think of any sort of word. Like I sometimes pull up the word moment. Like the word moment can mean something crazy different when you're talking about Hegel to when you're talking to Foucault or something like that. Or even the word power. Or each of them have given their whole new, longer, bigger, different definition of the thing they're talking about there.
Well, we're living in the world of that bifurcated like language.
Yeah, that's totally the Tower of Babel that we're living in. But part of that Tower of Babel, and I'd recommend listening to the start of Vanderklay here. Part of that whole thing is Vanderklay talks about how even Vervaeke, because Vervaeke's developed his own kind of long-winded ways of describing all the things in his Buddhist atheist ways. And strangely enough, is like all those philosophers and all these theologians, they're all kind of trying to have the same conversation, and they're kind of missing each other with definitions, And I think it's Sitch from Adam and Sitch who says all debates are ultimately just an argument about a definition.
Talk about this subject. Couple of things. Why are people interested in egregores? I think it's because, as Jonathan Pageau noted, now at the recession of modernity, people are now much more able to see that there are agents, beings at work through us, above us, below us in the world that we do not control. Part of the comfort of the Enlightenment view was that it left no agents in the world apart from ourselves, and that enlivened in us the hope that we could be masters of the universe. This is the same hope that moved Adam and Eve in the Genesis story. This is the same hope that is, in a sense, motivated by the fact that we have eternity in our hearts. And this is the ambition and hope that we can somehow remake the world in our image. This runs under Game B conversations. This runs under the Paul Kingsnorth, Mary Harrington conversations about trying to remake the world. This ambition is very much an enlightenment. Well, it's before the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment sort of breathes new life into it. And now, as we increasingly see, number one, that this effort is futile, number two, that we are not alone, and number three, that so often the things that we do with our hands brings us misery and not the glory and joy and utopia that we imagine we want. Well, suddenly our eyes are open to other spiritual, John Vervaeke will call them hyper agents, other forces in the world. Now, to get an understanding of these forces is very difficult for us, partly because we have gone through the Enlightenment. We are in modernity, even though it's receding, and we're not at all exactly sure of what we're dealing with. And I think part of why we're so interested in this is that, well, suddenly we hope that, well, maybe through some practices, through some procedures, we can get a handle on these things and use these things to achieve our own hubristic vision of, once again, controlling the world. It is that desire that is behind magic. It is that desire that is behind witchcraft. It is that desire that is behind all sorts of attempts at spiritualisms to gain power over others and even ourselves in order to achieve what we think we want. Now, the problems, as I've said in many videos, is that we don't even know what we want. We can't even adequately describe the good. We usually, as Chesterton notes, just describe it as the opposite of the evil we're trying to escape. But the good is surprisingly difficult for us to talk about, surprisingly difficult for us to portray. Now, I think this conversation makes great leaps, not only in terms of just having an honest conversation about this, but I think also in looking for a conversation that shines the light on this. And I think, especially in John Vervaeke, we find someone who's really wrestling with these ideas and wrestling with the implications. And I think along the way, because he's coming at this not from a Christian perspective, but from an outside the church perspective, that some of what he's seeing and articulating is difficult for those of us within the church to see and articulate for them, because we already in some ways have a language that is contextualized within the church, and we all sort of agree to elements of it and understand it and use it. But part of my whole effort throughout the history of this channel has been to try to be able to communicate with those outside the church in language that perhaps isn't See, part of the problem with the church is that the church tends to speak Christianese, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with Christianese. It's just that it's an in-house language. And if you want to communicate with people that are not in-house, you're going to need words that they understand. And I think this is part of the helpfulness of this conversation. So let's get going.
There's an inability of parasitic processing, the demonic. I mean, but this is this, Jonathan. This is
now this, of course, John Vervaeke has come up with this idea of parasitic processing, and I have the same problem with some of John Vervaeke's nomenclature and terminology that people outside the church have with the Christianese, which is inside the church. Parasitic processing. Well, what is a parasite? A parasite feeds on its host. Now, at some point, if the parasite gets too strong and the host too weak, the parasite destroys the host, and the parasite then itself dies. And that is an amazing illustration of what John is talking about in terms of the nature of evil.
I do think there's somewhat of that going on with Bednar and that other guy there, that they've altered the definition, and people are eavesdropping on a definition that's inside baseball. It's inside baseball talk, and it's not the common term of agency going on right there.
Right.
But one of the things I said to the Midnight Mormons is, like, I kind of feel a lot like Vervaeke. Like, I can go almost all the way there with people, all the way down the road to, we can talk about the logos almost exactly as you talk about your God, or we can talk about the spirit almost exactly in this way that Vervaeke defines spirit, and it's almost like this entity that's there, a type of being that's like almost kind of like a demonic being or an overall being that's a.
Isn't there a book called Auron that?
Okay, here it is. It's egregores.
Oh,
have you heard of egregores? They're talking about, and I don't think I'm pronouncing that right. Egregores. Egregores are.
Sounds like a dinosaur.
Egregore is an occult concept representing certain non-physical entity that arises from the collective thought of a descriptive group of people. So it's almost kind of like the zeitgeist from Hegel,
right?
Or the spirit of an age, or all these, how we start talking about how these people start acting like an entity. And Pageau's been talking about Gog and Magog and all these types of things. And
is it similar to the idea of what's it? Legion?
Yeah, like Legion and like all these things. And the thing is, like, Vervaeke is right there with them. Not only is he right there with them, he writes about these things and talks about them and thinks about them from his academic atheist angle and all that stuff. And I do think that he's gotten to like a level of speaking about it from a Platonic, Socratic concepts that he knows, and he's in with it. It's like he tapped into the language. It's like he figured out the other language inside of the Tower of Babel. He says, I'm able to talk with you, even though that, like, whatever that thing that we're talking about at the end of the thing, if it actually is an entity or not, I see it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But it's there. Like, I see what you're talking about. I don't know if that is actually the entity that you think it is, but I know what you're talking about. And that's almost kind of like how the logos kind of serves like a god or something like that. But it gets kind of esoteric, and Paul kind of talks about how it is even a little bit difficult. Like, you got to get way into Vervaeke to even follow the words he starts using for it. I mean, it all gets Tower of Babel. I was telling Greg from Quick, I brought up Charles Fourier again, and that's the wackadoo guy who was a socialist before Marx, and he had all these wacko utopian ideas and all these ideas about free love society, and that as soon as we all became socialists, the oceans would turn into lemonade, and then all the ocean creatures would come out and become our servants because we achieved socialism. But almost everybody, James Lindsay, just lately, if you listen to him today, he is talking about what exactly, he had a 15 minute video about what critical consciousness is. And I brought that up a lot lately too, of what the critical consciousness is. What the definition of woke is based off that critical consciousness thing. They're trying to bring about critical consciousness. But then that word critical consciousness, that sounds like one word, but it's actually a big, fat, different meaning. Listen to what James Lindsay says about it today. And if you really go all the way with the Marxist, it gets crazy metaphysical and crazy, almost kind of religious sounding.
Hey, whichever one you want to read, you read that there's this multi-stage process, this cult indoctrination process, this grooming process into consciousness. Class consciousness first, critical consciousness after, true consciousness to follow, which is a full Marxist consciousness. And so to make it kind of simple, I put this into maybe 8 stages, or 9 if you want to call, 8 stages, I guess. And the first stage of conscientization is class awareness. You have to convince people who are in the lower class in particular, whatever it is. So Marxism always says there's a stratification of society. There are some group of winners that's an upper class and some group of losers that's a lower class. It's the bourgeoisie is the upper class and the proletariat is the working class is the lower class for Marx. It's white versus people of color for critical race theory. It's those that get considered normal or get to consider themselves normal, and the people who are considered queer or outside of normal in queer Marxism or queer theory, and on it goes. So first you have to convince people, for Freire, there's the literate or the educated and the illiterate or uneducated. So same thing, there's an upper class and a lower class. You have to convince people of class awareness, that there's class period. There's an upper class and there's a lower class. In particular, you have to convince the lower class that they're in a lower class. And then the second thing, after you do that, it's not enough to just say, so there's a class structure, everybody kind of sees this, whatever, I get it. And it sucks in certain ways, I get that. That's not enough. That's only the very first stage. You don't have class consciousness by giving people class awareness, Lukács and Freire explain. You have to go further. You have to now explain to them, hey, it doesn't just suck, think about it. It actually dehumanizes you. And this is where it gets really culty, because now you're adding in a sense of vulnerability. a sense of fear and injustice and being wronged, this class antagonism that Marx referred to. It's dehumanizing you. You are being restrained from what it means to be truly human. That's what's happening to you. You have to be aware of the dehumanization here. That's the second stage of consciousness raising. So first, hey, you're in a class. Did you know that there's a class structure to society and you're in one or the other? And you need to know that. You need to know that it's consequential. It makes a difference. And then don't you know that this class structure is dehumanizing the underclass? Don't you understand that? Don't you see how it's hurting people if you're in the upper class? Don't you see how it's cheating you if you're in the lower class? And you create that division and that antagonism there. A third stage of conscientization is that you have to frame this in terms of a holistic understanding. It's not just us versus them. It's us with them in an antagonistic relationship. It's almost a yin and a yang. So you have to understand that if you're marginalized, then there must be somebody marginalizing you, a marginalizer. If you're oppressed, there must be an oppressor. And you are in an intrinsic relationship in that regard, a relationship of marginalization, of oppression. You have to understand that this is a relationship. You are not apart from one another. It's not us versus them. It's us and them together creating these intolerable conditions. So it doesn't just dehumanize you, by the way, it dehumanizes them too. And you heard this from the feminists. Patriarchy hurts men too. Misogyny hurts men too. You hear this from the Marxists. The bourgeoisie doesn't even know that it's dehumanizing, so they become alienated from their own true nature, which is a social being, because they're so invested in their own self-interest, their own private property, their own land holdings, whatever it happens to be, that they're not even truly human anymore because they're willing to dehumanize other people to keep that. So it's not just dehumanizing you, it's dehumanizing everybody, because this is a holistic understanding. That's the third stage of conscientization. You can see this as a cult indoctrination.
It's ultimately just the concept that you're supposed to see all the bad in our capitalistic white Western society or something like that. But what I'm talking about there is that gets all esoteric too. Marx, even though Marx is supposedly the scientific version of Charles Fourier, what's so funny about that is it turns out that that's who Dostoevsky was talking about as Fourier. That's who, in kind of like a private hidden group, one of the things Dostoevsky was talking about was Charles Fourier, and that was the group he got arrested for being in. And he got arrested for being in that group, and that's what led him to the moment where he got almost shot at a firing range, and that led him down the path of becoming what he is. But they had been discussing this wackadoo socialist, and that's what got them arrested. Almost any single philosopher who has a big enough name, there's a whole different language you need to learn to even try to understand the thing that they're saying when they go about trying to describe the totality of the universe. One of the things I've been saying to the Midnight Mormons is like, there's some sort of levels, like I'm kind of getting the thing that everybody's all saying kind of in a perennial way. Perennialism is kind of just the idea of maybe all these things are talking about the same God or something like that, or maybe they're not. Although in a weird way, Mormons and other Christians are perennialists. They're all kind of saying, yeah, we think you're talking about my same God. The atheists always bring up that thing is like, there's 2,000 gods and you think you got it right. And there's so many times where all these people are saying, no, I think we're all talking about the same God. I just think we're saying that we have a little bit, not all of us, but most of us are talking about that same God. We just kind of think we have different access to the intentions of that God. There's some sort of level, like I'm there with it. I'm there following all of it.
It has to be understood by everybody attending. That we are not about wokeness. We have a separate set of values that we understood, and B, we are not defined by our anti-wokeness. We are not an echo of an echo. We are our own thing. We are something that emerges from something more fundamental.
Okay, this is
positive values.
Yeah, this is the fascinating part, and you already brought up God, but I wonder how people such as yourself, who are very fact-oriented, very anti-symbolism, and people who are more evangelical, let's just say, very symbolism and moral-oriented rather than fact, are going to get along, and they're going to have to get along on some way. There's got to be some sort of compromise that both those subsets come to in order to, carve out a world that they want to live in.
Yeah, and I've been working on another philosophical project, which I'll make a video about at some point, about a kind of God that's available to atheists, rooted in the ideas that were put forward by Spinoza, which constitute more than just a rejection of propositions of the deity. The problem with new atheism was that it was fundamentally defined by the lack of belief in God. It was a negative philosophy. It was an echo. It wasn't its own thing. And this created the epistemological rut that allowed wokeness to ultimately infect it. But if you have a positive conception of atheism, one that isn't rooted in the sort of positive conception that atheism plus ultimately succeeded in inculcating into atheistic institutions. If you have something that's more consonant with the Christian culture in which someone like Spinoza was situated, whilst rejecting the metaphysical aspects of it, but retaining the values, then you do have room for compromise. But it has to be understood that there's a place for there's a time and place
for mythology, theology, spirituality, and just basic philosophical value systems that are communicated and shared.
Yeah, and that is not located inside of the science classroom.
But I haven't had like that road to Damascus moment to like say that, like, believe other people when they say they feel that they have had moments like that and that sort of thing. But they've talked a lot on this interview about Kairos, Chronos and Kairos. Chronos is about time. They're both ideas coming from the Greek. And Chronos is just the general idea of time passing. But Kairos is kind of like the singularity moment that we're all talking about, right? Kairos is like this moment of transformation or becoming, or all things hitting at once. And I think what they talk a lot about in this podcast is we all kind of feel like that moment's coming. I'll let them say it.
The way that you're saying it is that you can't manufacture the Kairos moment that will cause the monumental change. You can't manufacture the moment of expansion. You can't make it up. It's something.
Now, again, Kairos, there's these two terms in Greek for time. One is chronos, which is sort of ongoing time. And Kairos is that moment of transformation. And this part of the video I found really profound. John's about to give a really, I think, a profound speech in here. And but what Jonathan Pageau mentions is that you can't manufacture the Kairos moment. And so often in this ongoing conversation that we're having in this little corner of the internet with people who want to transform, and so often I bump into people who are they're getting interested in Christianity. They sense the hunger, they sense the need. They might even be knocking on the door, and they challenge and say, didn't you say knock and the door will be opened? Ask, seek, and you will find. Ask and it will be given to you. Well, you can't manufacture the Kairos moment. You can't self-transform. The transformation needs to come from above and work in us. All of the Christian language is like that. Notice the book of Acts, the day of Pentecost, the sound of a rushing wind, tongues of fire, and they are transformed, and the disciples are no longer this hapless bunch you find just kind of trailing along with Jesus, never getting him. Suddenly you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the earth.
Thing which happens in a revelation, you could say. And so until that revelation happens, it seems like, even though maybe what you're saying is right, the only thing to do is to try to breathe life into the forms that have been given to you, because, or else what?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. One of the things that these guys have come across a whole bunch, maybe the Midnight Mormons will come across a lot more too now, especially if they get in the same realms that these people are playing. Paul calls it his little corner of the internet, is they'll start finding all sorts of guys who've gone down like an atheism path, or almost kind of like a postmodernism path. That brings us to that moment of saying like, oh gosh, maybe I do want to recapture this thing that everybody always said was there, and when we never really felt like we captured it, but we want to recapture it. But then they just kind of feels like it's always just barely out of reach. And they're talking about how like you can't manufacture that Kairos moment. If I'd give some criticism to the Midnight Mormons, is they'll get into the thing of like, in that same episode, Kwaku will say, oh yeah, it was cool to be an atheist when you were 13 or something, but it's just not cool now. And it's like, well, because Kwaku says it's not cool now, that's not going to be my Kairos moment.
Right.
It's going to be more manufactured that. But you and I have gotten so much into these dark enlightenment types, which might be a little bit of a shift here, that so much of what they're doing is in some sort of level. And I do, the more I read and listen to their stuff, the more I know that they're not just purely talking out of their butts, but they almost kind of like push this manufactured moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the accelerationism.
Well, and beyond that, beyond not just the acceleration of like the grand narrative of the whole society,
Right.
but they're also they push manufacturing that moment individually too. Like it's pushed on both the fractal levels, you know.
What's
Whereas
interesting,
I think the humble Christian is actually just, it's got to happen when it happens.
I totally agree with that. And I think I do agree. I think that, I mean, think about this. It's like, if you're going to quote somebody like, you know, I mean, where I'll come back and just and have that same kind of criticism for, you know, that where I can maybe line up with a little bit with what John Lynn's saying versus, I don't know what that other guy's, if he was stake president or in the state presidency or whatever. I don't know where he was at, but, you know, or even Bednar. It's like, listen, like, I think it's very alienating too. Like, I mean, if you think about it, when you and I were teenagers, we would have been like, screw you, you know what I mean? For like saying something like that to us, because, you know, I think that it may be well intentioned, and it may be kind of one of those things where you're like drawing the line in the sand, sort of like, you know, you're bracing a young tree to grow up straight on that kind of thing. But sometimes Alma the Younger couldn't have become one of the greatest missionaries in the Book of Mormon unless he was the vilest of sinners beforehand. And you and I have talked about that too. Some of the best missionaries I knew, I mean, out on the mission, and a few of my best friends on my mission were were partiers in high school and out rallying around and getting crazy and all that kind of stuff. And you know, I told it to actually said this to my son today, you know, talking about it, is like, you know, I think that the ones who really were out there and did the best out on the mission were people who really genuinely applied the principles of the atonement in their life, and out of faith, that Kairos moment for them. And it's the same with the prodigal son. You know what I mean? He didn't come home until it was right, until it was his time. You know.
Well, so one of the weird things, this guy Auron, I think he pronounces like Auron, MacIntyre. He is a dark enlightenment type. Kevin and I talked about that for quite a while the other day, and
Boyce's face.
What?
I just laughing at Boyce's.
Oh, the face of Boyce's face right there looks like he just smelled something nasty. Yeah. This is Benjamin Boyce, Wokal Distance, and Auron, and they're talking partially because James Lindsay lit into Auron. He's just not having it. He doesn't like that Auron talks about this concept of peer of like the liberal world order.
Usually it's Boyce and Wokal Distance and Lindsay.
Yeah.
So I was.
I think Lindsay's being a bit reactionary or too much of a knee-jerk disgust or dislike for Auron by far.
Yeah.
I think he's a pretty smart guy. Some of the reactionary
part of that's probably rooted in James's probably very, very, you know, strong disgust for postmodernism in general.
Yeah, it's postmodern or anti-liberalism, and one of the deals is that he's spent so much time dealing with bad arguments against liberalism that are really crap bad arguments, that when good ones come along, it's kind of just like, oh, shut up, just get out of my face, you know. And the thing is, like, I think these guys do have some good arguments. Sargon even noticed it. I mean, maybe I'll put it in the show notes or something, but Sargon wrote Carl Benjamin wrote a long article about some criticisms about liberalism that liberalism needs to take on. And just this week, he also went into debate with Sitch and Adam about that. And Auron's been popping up because he and James Lindsay butted heads about it a little bit. They've been popping up more and more in the news. Kevin and I were talking about it. I think Kevin and I were out ahead of people a little bit on all this. And they had a whole podcast going over at Auron and Carl Benjamin. And Wokal Distance is kind of just barely getting, he came onto this podcast a little bit, not knowing what he's getting into, I'd say. Like he didn't really know what the right-wing postmodernism is. And he even mentioned here that he doesn't really know Deleuze and Guattari, and that's really where most of the right-wing postmodernism jumps off of. And I already knew it because I knew Wokal would be like that, because I was kind of a little bit the same with Wokal. I was so drenched in the left-wing postmodernism, the stuff that just really gets focused on at universities. And you don't realize in this debate, you know, it's not really a debate, they're just having a conversation, because a lot of the stuff just, you could tell, was kind of just new to Wokal, and Wokal's well read. You know, he's more, I've read a ton of postmodernism, Wokal's read more than I have. And I like that he gets into Searle and intentionality and all that stuff. Just today, he put a big long. Oh man, I'm getting in the weeds, but intentionality is I'll cut that out. That's weeds. Okay, but let me just say here that he kind of pointed the same thing. In the middle of this, he was getting talked to and he was getting barked at, and he realized liberalism has the same problem of moral philosophy that the Midnight Mormons are. And we're poking around. This stuff's all kind of converging in the same spot, and it's. I think it still all does have to do with agency and where you get your axioms.
Civilization has to get back to its original origin point, the thing without which Enlightenment liberalism cannot survive. And I'm going to bring back the concept of the Logos. And I think that the thing that is jettisoned from Western civilization by postmodernism, which a lot of it to do what it's done, is that it is the jettisoning and the attack on the Logos. That's
some of the words, because Vervaeke will use the Logos too, but Vervaeke also uses the word of like a fixed center point of what the direction is we're all aiming at. But I think what all these postmodern problems bring up is that most liberals are just kind of barely now waking up, or it's dawning on them that no, it is all, just as Jacob Hansen said, even though he's dropping the mic on atheists, but what these guys kind of point out too is you're not just dropping the mic on atheism. Our atheism kind of is a product of liberalism. It's a product of the Enlightenment. You're dropping a mic on that whole entire frame. And I do think Mormonism was best in its liberal Enlightenment frame. There's some people pushing, Kevin and I pulled it up, and maybe we'll talk more about it in the future, pushing for a postmodern Mormonism. And I like a Mormonism that definitely holds to Enlightenment liberalism. Some of that stuff they're talking about, the moral relativism, some people aim that criticism directly at the whole entire Enlightenment, which I think the Enlightenment had to be there for Mormonism to come about. I mean, I think that's even, correct me if I'm wrong, what a lot of Mormon theology believes is that we kind of had to get to that moment for it to come about.
Yeah, definitely.
And,
I mean, it's talked about a lot, and there's the Reformation had to happen as a precursor to Restoration.
So one of the things they're pointing at, and one of the things they're saying here, and Wokal realizes it halfway through the conversation, is that liberalism does need to bounce off of a center point, and that center point he's going to say is bringing back the Logos or something like that. But that's in the realization that I'd say Carl Benjamin's realizations and these other people's realizations is that if there is no center point, and that boils all the way back down to what the Midnight Mormons are saying, and the atheists don't like to hear it, or they like to just say, well, it is all as postmodern as it can be, and that is the game. We are in that power game. If you ever want a society to get back to all aiming at the same spot, there might be some variation in that aim, like we used to think about in liberalism, like there was a conservative liberal or a liberal, but we all kind of had generally the same aim. There's got to be some sort of a winning substrate underneath that, which is something like a Christian God.
And there was that.
And we could go deeper. We'd have to go farther into that, but that's kind of what a lot of deals of moral philosophy and axioms are, kind of teasing out why axioms are tough and they're hard to land on and hard to make sense of. An axiom is kind of just like the ground floor of things that we can all agree upon.
It's the foundation.
And what everybody's finding out right now is that when you get down to the bottom of them, you can't ultimately prove them. So they have to be finally just like a claim, like just the claim is a self-evident claim. That's the postmodern moment that we're in. That's the battle we're in. There's a reason that even those anti-liberal right-leaning people and the left-leaning people and the moment we're entirely in is all happening while we're in this Kairos moment, is because the axioms at the center of not just religion, but it's at the center of liberalism are falling apart.
So there's just this post where this guy says universities are right-wing in effect, structure and deed, but left-wing in word. They sell status and prestige, run on hierarchy, are snobby and elitist, have the social effect of redistributing from the lower class upward, but they are filled with Marxists. And you put capital realism.
You cut out I put capitalist realism, which is referring to Mark Fisher's book, which we talked about before, but you and I were talking about that earlier.
Right. And I just responded saying, if you define it this way, it's only because left wing is incapable of structure and organization. By that, the concept of political party is conservative.
Yeah. I mean, all structure, all hierarchy usually ultimately gets back to that. And you find them tripping and stumbling over themselves. But that's where that right-wing postmodernism comes from. Is it's almost, I was telling you earlier, the capitalist realism, even going back to maybe Mencius Moblug, but Nick Land was kind of more the postmodernist of these guys who realized things like that. And I think it's kind of funny because there's still kind of famous books on the left, like capitalist realism, although Nick Land is now considered to have gone fully right-wing. One of the things that they do is they're just these kind of professors, these postmodern professors who, in a weird way, get red-pilled. I don't know how any other way to say it. It's almost kind of like they have this Thomas Sowell moment, these realizations that all these things can't hold up and they aren't real, but they still want to hold on to their radicalness or their Marxism, and so they get to a point of saying like, oh my gosh, I can't escape the capitalism. Zizek lives in this realm. Zizek lives in this realm.
Right.
They realize they can't escape the capitalism and the neoliberalism, and so they say, well, okay, just go along with it and go along with it harder, But it's so funny because those people read those books, and instead of landing on like some sort of moment of saying, hey, maybe it's because there's some sort of natural substrate underneath that, which is the guys who really get right wing, because Mark Fisher's not right wing. Mark Fisher held on to his, and the reason you'll see the left point at Mark Fisher more, because both these sides will point at Mark Fisher, but the left will ignore Nick Land and point at Mark Fisher, because Nick Land just did the single additional thing of saying, I'm right wing now. Whereas Mark Fisher says, no, I'm still a Marxist. So you can still listen to Mark Fisher. And all he said is, I'm a Marxist and we can't escape capitalism. There's nothing we can do. And so they're allowed to use Mark Fisher and say, gosh, and they can just get like all black-pilled about it. Like, we can't escape it. Oh my gosh.
That's the thing is that I think that's probably one of the greatest ironies of the postmodern left is that in the rejection of grand narratives, they are so chained to narrative that they can't get beyond it to be able to talk to somebody and have a rational conversation.
It's also why I was explaining it to Marty, is why I think they're getting lost. I mean, they're lost, and the Mormons and the religious and the other people are getting better. And the Mormons used to be lost in this.
Well,
and the sense is that they've sharpened their knives. They've opened up the dialogue. They're having the dialogos, and they are able to articulate and defend themselves and defend their positions better and better and better. Whereas that other side, who refuses to even listen to what's being said, is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And it's just somebody was saying like, well, maybe they aren't getting weaker, even they're building up their power or whatever. I'm telling you, it's like a natural law of the universe, of God, if you want to use that term, that by being insular, they're getting weaker. They are even though they're still growing their power and still pushing their stuff, they are losing the logos,
Yeah, exactly.
But that book is so dumb. I was listening to it just earlier when you called and said you had time to do this, and maybe we could have organized this one all better, but maybe I can edit down so it is all pretty fast to the point. But I was explaining it to you, so I'm just repeating, you've already heard. But the stupid idea that all they did is like realize just kind of like the most basic parts of capitalism and economics and free enterprise around people, and then they get devastated by it, and they have to announce it. They still have to announce it from their Marxist terms, and their Marxist terms are still that state of nature was actually a conspiracy theory put upon them by the powers that be. The capitalists made it that way. We've made this all-encompassing, all universal way of being that nobody can even think outside of. Zizek even said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. But it's still a conspiracy theory put on them. It kind of goes along too with James Lindsay's podcast today, the short one about critical consciousness. And they just hold on to this idea that it's this thing being put upon you. But it gets back to one of the things that we talked about when we covered Adorno and when we covered the Dark Enlightenment, is they always have this constant thing of saying that our experiences or our life or our consciousness is fake. It's not real until it's seeing the things the way they see it. And then you can actually start having real experiences. And I think that's one of the...
that's what being woke is.
Yeah, and that's one of the dividing lines between them and us and that sort of thing, because from our liberal or religious perspective or whatever, we're not thinking that they're having fake life right now. You know, you guys are having real life right now.
Yeah.
You're scrambled up, but you're having real experiences. And
just change your sex and see.
yeah. And, so they have that, both sides of them have that big construal that we're never really actually experiencing real love or real emotion or real passion, because we're getting it through this plastic fake version of it, through the capital or neoliberal version of it. And I think over here on our point, we're still always at the level of saying, no, you can have those moments. You can have reality and realness anywhere, inside of anything, anytime, if you're being real and if you're being authentic and actual authenticity, not the way they've hijacked that word too.
Well, I think, again, one of the fundamental axioms in Mormonism is the whole idea of the premortal existence and the war in heaven, Christ pushing agency, the plan of agency. Hey, we're gonna take a risk here and let you go down and do and make your own choices. And on the opposite end was the curtailing of agency and the curtailing of consequence. And to me, it really is. That's always kind of been like what I've seen in Marxist thinking. And a lot of these, just like that quote that you mentioned earlier, they want to authoritatively make these decisions for us for our own good. It's also the argument that Dostoevsky makes in Brothers Karamazov, and when he does the Grand Inquisitor, because they're sitting there talking about, we can't let them go out and make their own choices now. You know what I mean? He's talking to Christ, and he's saying, you kind of messed it up. It's the whole logos thing. You're the one who's you're infringing and imposing the logos upon everybody. We just want to, and they can't handle it. That's essentially kind of what they're saying. And that's kind of like the roots of Marxism. It's the roots of
you thrust this existence on me. How dare you?
Yeah. And it's really the whole idea of the whole satanic idea, of Satan's plan of the curtailing of agency and consequence.
Yeah. And Satan, I love the theology of Mormonism. Satan said, I'll do it all for you and you'll get back safe. I pulled up, maybe I'll stick it on here. Remember to stick it in, Chris. This picture of this guy from the video game Earthbound, this guy called Piggy, who got himself into like an eternally safe pod. And that then the Japanese video gamer was able to point out that was like the ultimate punishment too, because he was stuck forever inside of that eternally safe pod, away from experience. And Peterson once gave this description of, if you take your little kid and you say, I want to make this kid invincible because I don't want this kid to ever feel pain, at some sort of level you say, okay, well, I'll replace her arm with a bionic arm, and I'll place her brain with a brain that can't feel pain, and I'll and pretty soon after a while, that's not that kid anymore. Yeah. So you erased what that kid is. Like, in some sort of level, we are defined by what our vulnerabilities are. It is the ultimate tyranny to say, hey, we're going to keep you completely safe for your safety. We see it coming down the line, and the bad guys of Germany back in the day used it and realized it was something they could use. And now we see modern day fascists pull out that term at every given chance they get, that for our safety, they're going to do all this stuff.
Yeah.
And even though a lot of it's bullcrap, even if it were true, it would be tyranny.
Well, that's the thing too. I mean, look at the jabby. You know what I mean? It's like, listen, maybe I would take the jabby if you just let me just lay off and let me think about it and let me make my own choice.
You would have gotten way more people to do it if you're just like, man, we got all these jabbies, but you don't got to take them. But boy, so much of what's happened over the past couple of years is that if they actually claim, the people of science and the people of evidence actually claim to believe in any sort of thing like that, they would use some sort of ideas like social psychology on how to get people to take a jab. They would use ideas, but the thing is, I do think that they're competent in creating. They actually wanted to create the friction. We've obviously seen so many things going on just this past week in Holland. We see them for the safety of the Holland people, the people in Holland, that they need to close down 30% of farms because they're going to save global warming because of that. And
We need to save the populations of the earth. We need to save the earth by shutting down the food.
30% of our food supply here in this one little country. We're gonna save the earth, even though the carbon emissions have gone up to double this in China, and nobody's doing anything about that. But it's so dumb. It's so dumb, and it's so obviously just like a move by tyrannical a-holes. But then to go back to tie in like the tyranny and all that stuff, coming back to agency and all that stuff. One of the reasons we like Peterson, and Peterson's been getting a lot of guff lately, even from fans, because he joined up with the Daily Wire and he's been having these Twitter fights and all that stuff. But Peterson's not our prophet or anybody's prophet. His ideas or his concepts, and most of his ideas, like I say in the Malcolm Gladwell, well, he's pulling away from other people and just synthesizing them down in one place, much like we do. But his ultimate point, the thing he's most famous for, clean your room, is getting back to an agency thing. It's at any given moment, on a given day, in the face of the Marxists or in the face of even the neo-reactionaries, is that in any given moment, and no matter how bad of a situation you find yourself in, you can stop in that moment and have a real moment of agency and a real moment of life and a real moment of living, and stop and clean up your room. You have that agency, and obviously you have the agency to choose wrongly too. That's where we disagree with Bednar, but they were obviously making some different esoteric point. But obviously you have the choice to choose. You have the choice to aim down. And we're just part of a world and part of a push of saying, always keep that choice. And
well,
of course,
and that's what sin is. It's like you don't have the option to make sin, to commit sin. I mean, if you don't have agency, you can't sin. You don't need an atonement.
Yeah.
That's where I'm thinking like, well, then Bednar, I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think that it just boils back down to bad definitions or unclear.
He's obviously not making that point, or he, like you said, maybe he's trying to pragmatically get people to think in a way, like get yourself to a point of thinking that you don't even have the choice, and you'll even be more righteous if you can get yourself to thinking like it's not even a choice. Kind of like if you get like any sort of bodybuilder type person who's like, it's not a choice for me to not go get my gains today type stuff.
Well, and I mean, times are completely different. You know what I mean? When we grew up, they were saying basically kind of the same thing. We expect all young men, all worthy young men, to go on a mission. Okay.
How exactly did they word it? Like how?
I think that was it.
We were
that was
talking
it.
about that.
We have the expectation that all worthy young men, and that was our generation, all worthy young men serve a mission. That was the expectation. I don't think I think that it's now just trying to well, how do I say the same message to this new generation, postmodern kids growing up?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where they're growing up in a world that doesn't have.
He's obviously talking to kids that been given moral relativism,
correct,
as something that can be used as to say that my moral relativism is the correct choice.
Yeah.
And that's different than us who grew up in the times of the liberals, who thought we always knew that having a choice didn't mean it was the correct choice.
Right.
Whereas nowadays there has been teachings in the postmodern moral relativistic world that if you chose and it's true to you, then it's good.
Yeah, your truth.
Yeah. So and obviously if you're talking to that, it's a bit of a different point. You almost kind of have to be. They do have to be reminded that just because you chose something doesn't mean that choice is consequence free or the correct or the best choice. Because that's some of the biggest problems with agencies. Sometimes there's two good choices. You're trying to choose the best one, you know. But
right.
I don't know. I think we ended up hitting all the stuff. Although I do think that had we planned a second of this, we could have marched right through it pretty well. But having not planned it, and I think after editing it, I think it'll seem coherent.
Yeah.
It's always kind of weird.
No, I think so.
Ends up.
We made a good round. We connected everything back to what we were originally talking about.
I had no idea we were going to go this route.
Yeah, I didn't either, man.
It all kind of wrapped in, but it's kind of cool to see happen.
But it did incorporate a lot of the stuff that I thought we were going to talk about too.
Yeah, we got around to a lot of different things. So. Anything else?
No. just glad to get back up on here.
We put in, even though we think he's a goobus, we put in some agreement with John DeLynn, even though
how about that?
He's obviously got some things to think about in some of the claims he made there about some of his own worldviews.
It's obvious just the opportunism of cherry picking like something like that and kind of speaking out of both sides of his mouth that like he doesn't have any, like he's not trying to spread a message of how to live one's life or anything like that, you know.
Or that he thinks that kids can't make big fat decisions
except for hormone blockers.
Yeah.